The Y Curve with Phil Dobbie and Roger Hearing.
It's the 70s all over again.
The workers united will never be defeated. The workers united will never be defeated.
That's the sound of railway workers on a picket line in Manchester this week, with RMT union boss Mick Lynch firing up the crowds outside Westminster last weekend.
If your jobs are being stripped from you, you are in a class struggle. And there are people over there in that Parliament who are meant to be on our side, who've got to answer the question, which side are you on?
And the government's response? We'll have to change the law. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps speaking on Sky News earlier this week.
And as always hoped we wouldn't need to get to this point. But for future strikes, both in this current strike, but also for other strikes, we're going to ensure that the law is firmly on the passenger's side, on the consumer's side, when it's not a rail strike.
So this week, who's right and who's wrong when it comes to this strike action? But more importantly, what's gone wrong with trains in Britain? They're seen as expensive and unreliable, and despite the promises of privatisation all those years ago, the taxpayer is still bailing them out. Meanwhile, our roads are still clogged with cars and freight. Will we ever see another golden age of rail, or will it all just slowly rust away? Today, are we running late on rail reforms in this country?
The Y Curve.
And welcome to the latest edition of The Y Curve. I'm Roger Hearing, in with Phil Dobbie, and we're going to be interrogating a really rather big subject, of course, the railways, what they're doing, what they should be doing.
Yeah, I think there's 4 questions we really want to ask in this week, where obviously there's so much disruption because of the rail strike. Are we actually getting the rail service that we need? Aside from this strike, just generally, are railways fit for purpose? Are we getting, as taxpayers, are we getting value for money? Because there's a lot of money being ploughed into providing these rail services around the country, even though supposedly they've all been privatised. Are railway workers getting paid enough? That's the question of the week, isn't it? Is this strike justified? And then looking forwards, is there an actual plan for the future of railways? Do we actually know where we're going, Roger?
Well, I think it's simpler than that. I think there's 3 basic questions. It all relates to transport, really. What's our destination? How are we going to get there? And will we get there on time? And that's what we're going to debate. And we're delighted to say that joining us is, I would say, the doyen of commentators on the railways and transport, Christian Wolmar. Christian, welcome to the Y Curve. Thanks so much for being with us today. Well, let's address that first question, I suppose, both from Phil and I. Really, it's more or less the same question. What sort of railways should Britain be having in the 21st century?
Well, let's first of all say that it's great that we have a railway and that it's thriving, apart from the recent difficulties and problems. But look, this is a 19th century invention that was, at the time, the only way, really, of getting around fast around countries. It basically, before that, it was the horse and lousy roads. And suddenly you could, get from one end of Britain to the other in a few hours. And that transformed the nature of both the transport system, but also was the genesis of the capitalism that then kind of has taken us to where we are today. So it's wonderful that this 19th century invention has been remodeled, really, to survive in the 21st. And what you need now is rather different from that. It's no longer the only way of getting around. It's, of course, a way, one way, along with everything from walking and cycling to driving fast on motorways and even domestic aviation. So what it has to do is establish the core markets in which it's good and work on those. And so what are they? Well, in terms of passengers, they're clearly commuter markets where, going into town for employment or school or whatever is, hell on the roads, and the railways perform a wonderful function of that, whether it's trams, the underground or suburban railways. The other market where they really can make a big difference, of course, is the intercity. How really do you choose to get between London and Manchester? If you've got the choice, you take the train. It's just over 2 hours. It's a great way of getting there. it rather than 4 hours on the M1 and M6, absolute nightmare. And then the third bit is the freight sector. What are the railways good at doing in terms of freight? They're good at carrying bulk things like aggregates and coal and whatever, and they're good at carrying big boxes. So those are the things that we should work towards having a railway that thrives in those sectors.
Right. And if you ask people what do they think of the rail system as it is, and I think you'd get words like expensive, unreliable, slow perhaps if you compare it with many other parts of the world. And I sort of had that thought, but I've actually started using the train a bit more lately. So I went up to see my mum who lives in Cheshire, and I live down in Farnham in Surrey. And at the time, I thought, oh, that's a bit pricey because it cost me £102.60 for your off-peak return. But when I sort of tried to compare that to the cost of driving, and you sort of throw in all the costs. So there's an insurance company called Nimblefins. No, I've never heard of them either. They've just done some research that they reckon by the time you factor in all the costs, it costs 47 pence per mile to run a car these days. And obviously with fuel prices, that's only going to get higher. So actually, on that basis, it would cost £193.64 to reach my mum. So actually, on that basis, trains are very good value. And then I looked at how much it costs to get into to London from Farnham at peak time, £36.50, which everyone here says that's horrendous, the cost of trains. But that's 45p per mile. So that's actually cheaper than the cost of running a car. And of course, it takes an hour each way, whereas travelling from here to London by car would take, 2 hours, 2.5 hours each way. And then you've got to park. And then you're, when you buy the ticket, it says this is 70% less CO2 than driving. So actually, on all that basis, it's a very lengthy way of actually saying, even though we don't think it, railways are actually quite good value for money, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, they should be better value for money. I think the pricing structure is insane. And I can give an example of that. When I was at Paddington Station the other day at 5 o'clock in the evening, I was buying a ticket that was quite expensive. And then these two Americans arrived at the desk and said, we want to get to Bristol. And they said, well, it's going to cost you £250 for the two of you to get to Bristol. But if you wait till 7 o'clock, which is about an hour and a half away, then it will only cost you £70 or £80 for the two of you. And that kind of thing is completely insane. But from a societal point of view, it's very important to recognise that the railways have enormous advantages, as you suggest, in terms of the environment, in terms of reducing congestion, in terms of the health benefits of the fact that people have to walk to the station and maybe kind of exercise a little bit, whereas when they jump in their car, it's door to door and they get absolutely no exercise. It's totally unhealthy. So there are huge societal advantages. And that's why, to come on in a way to your next question, that's why talking about the railways in terms of taxpayers' money and it being a waste and so on is really nonsensical.
So Christian, that it's a service, in a sense, a public service, which should be offered via, in the way that other services used to be. Some of them before they were privatised, of course, but perhaps nationalised service simply offers people a relatively cheap way of travel. That's the future.
That's absolutely right. And it should be presented as such. And the trouble is you get some politicians who are anti-rail who say, oh, this is all a waste of money. Well, as is easy to point out, and Peter Hitchens did it in a column recently, we don't pay for Acacia Avenue. We don't pay for that infrastructure to use it. We just have our car and our car drives along Acacia Avenue. Our kids go to school. We don't pay for that. We go to hospital when we're ill or injured, and we don't pay for that. We don't pay for the army. We don't pay for the police. So in the same way, the railways are a service, which of course we will pay something towards, but it doesn't mean we have to pay the whole cost of it. And what I can't stand, and after writing about this for 30 years, I'm still banging on about it, is that you get these people who just say, well, the railways have to be commercial. No, they don't. They really, really don't. They're a service. You can't, for example, run the London Underground commercially. That it just is too expensive to provide that service, to dig the tunnels, to create new lines and so on. It's never going to work, right? It just doesn't work commercially. But my God, it works from a social society point of view.
And I guess it's the point, isn't it? It's the interplay between rail and all the other services that you use. So if you're getting people off rail, you are perhaps getting them off. I mean, if we didn't have trains going into London, then just imagine how long it would take to drive into London. So there's that societal benefit is sort of cost subsidising, the damage to the environment, but also the congestion that we'd see on other forms of transport.
Absolutely. You try to tell them that to the drivers, the motorists are obsessed with, the car is the only way of getting around. I shouldn't be paying my taxes towards these train companies or whatever. And of course, by paying those taxes, they're benefiting from it. But unfortunately, society doesn't seem to work out, or the presentation of our transport choices and is not made within that framework. We would just say, well, it's just, the trains are subsidised and that's it.
I'm so old, and one of the great advantages of that is, of course, I get a senior citizens rail card, and that cuts it down a lot. But I'm also old enough to remember British Rail. I mean, talk about presentation. My God, British Rail was a byword for incompetence and inability to get you there. We're getting there, I think, was one of the slogans everyone thought was so funny. Most people don't have a rosy remembrance, Christian, of what British Rail was like. And the theory was privatise and you get investment. You get real money put in to get more carriages, more rolling stock, better carriages, better services. And I mean, in a sense, certainly in the first part of it, that was true, wasn't it?
Well, no. And as you know, I've written this book called A British Rail, A New History, which looks at this, obviously, in some depth. And there's no doubt that in the early days, British Railways, it was then called, was a pretty moribund organisation. It kept steam engines for far too long. It had a very poor management structure. It spent a lot of money on something called the modernisation plan in the 50s that didn't really work very well. But in the last 10 years of its existence, it got the right structure. It was divided into 3 passenger groupings: Intercity, Network South East, and Regional Railways. And Intercity was such a well-liked brand that it was imitated across the world. There's services called Intercity in all sorts of places. It was profitable. It ran, efficient, speedy, frequent services between the main cities, towns and cities in Britain, and it was highly effective. Now, the interesting one out of this is Network South East, which was the commuter services around London, which were a disparate bunch of commuter services, some of them very poor, some of them okay. That was generally sorted out. And Network South East actually broke even, which is extraordinary for a service that is very heavily used in the mornings, very heavily used in the evenings, but little used kind of during the day. And by encouraging people to use it more during the day, British Rail managers, notably a guy called Chris Green, who's very innovative, actually managed to turn the economics round. And so to then kind of say, oh, British Rail was, this tired old organisation, was a complete mistake. And it was privatised at just the wrong time. If it had been privatised 10 years before, he said, oh, yes, it was an inefficient organisation that was badly run and was not commercially minded. In fact, the British Rail that was broken up at privatisation was, an efficient, effective organisation that created a lot of, interesting brands like Traveller's Fair and, as I said, Intercity and Casey Jones, and that was actually looking outwards and was cost effective.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about my youth as well. I'm obviously, as you can tell from the voice,
considerably younger,
quite a few years younger than Roger. But what, 3 or 4 even?
Decades.
And I was interested in trains when I was a young lad, and it was British Rail, and I was a bit of a rail nerd for a while until I realised if I wanted to have a girlfriend, I probably needed to move on from that part of my life.
I went through the same process.
But the British Rail I remember is the company that was looking at the APT, the Advanced Passenger Train that tilted, high-speed train that was tilting around the corners, and the high-speed diesel train, the HST. That was all quite innovative. They were
numbers and initials were things you like.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. And that innovation was coming from within rather than buying trains from overseas. So it seems to have lost a lot of that as well.
That's right. I mean, British Rail was not just a train company. It owned hotels.
Yeah.
It ran the ferries. It ran, quite interesting services like motor rail and sleeper services. It was a whole huge kind of transport undertaking.
So it's cut off at its prime, is what you're saying, basically. But so how has it gone so wrong when we look at, taxpayers' value for money now? So total government support, these are figures I got from the Office of Rail and Road. In 2021 prices, so it's comparable to, let's compare then and now in 2021 prices. In 1985 to 1990, government support per year averaged £1.7 billion. For the 5 years to 2019, so the same value of money, 9.1 billion. So the cost of running railways to the taxpayers mushroomed more than 5 times in the last 30 or 40 years. That is the exact opposite of what Margaret Thatcher promised us.
But can I drop into this, Christian?
I want to say it wasn't Margaret Thatcher who privatised.
It was John Major.
Very important.
Right. Oh yes, John Major, very much a train man. Similar interests, I think, probably in terms of train numbers in all that. But no, Christian, the point I was going to make was what's happened. Those figures recently. Don't forget, a number of the franchises were brought back even before the pandemic because of failure of performance. So that sense of the government putting more money in may be related to that.
Yeah, no, it started before that. It wasn't because they were brought in-house. They were brought in-house because they failed. They didn't. It wasn't then that the costs went up after they were brought in-house. And this is a big irony, about which I have written many times, is the fact that one of the reasons for privatisation was to cut costs and make British Rail more efficient. And quite the opposite happened. And when you start thinking about it, it's pretty logical, because what the privatisation did was to break up a unified organisation into lots of little component parts, which then had to have contracts with one another, which then didn't necessarily have incentives that were aligned, which were all kind of trying to make a profit. And it just was a much more expensive and inefficient process than had gone previously. In fact, the BBC did something like that. I'll give you an example of what sort of thing. The BBC used to use its own archives, and it didn't charge for them. And then it started charging to use its own archives. And of course, people went elsewhere and didn't bother using the BBC archives, and it cost the organisation more. The same thing happened in the railways in Spain. You got
internal pricing going on.
Internal pricing kind of was. Yes, it's disguised. You don't know what those internal costs are. But when you try and kind of externalize them and expose them, you end up kind of paying a lot more for things, because you're all paying each other kind of large amounts of money to do things which before were done in a kind of coherent, integrated way. And that's why privatization, and in particular fragmentation, was such a bad idea, and they're now trying to fix it.
Well, one of the issues, obviously, there, Christian, is the you have the stations and the track in one form of ownership, and the railway companies in another. I mean, the confusions, obviously, and multiplicities of cost are obvious there too. But in a sense, I mean, we're talking, I suppose, into the same idea that what is needed, in a sense, is re-nationalisation. But how do we get there? Is it a question now of just overnight saying, right, enter companies, forget that, bring everything back in-house, the trains, the rolling stock, the track, the stations, all of that, and make it one national enterprise? In other words, go back to pre-privatisation.
And before you answer, Christian, just an observation. I mean, this would have been a hugely controversial thing to say a couple of years ago, that we obviously need to re-nationalise railways. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was saying that, and he was lambasted for it. I suspect many Tory MPs now will be saying that's exactly what we need
because
as well.
Because it kind of happened during the pandemic anyway.
It's already happened, yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, Peter Hitchens, who is a right-wing commentator, who's a great fan of bringing it back. The trouble is, chaps, is that once you break something up and you then kind of sell off most of it. Some of it disappears, like British Rail had a very good research unit that kind of developed things. It used to manufacture at least some of its own trains. It did all sorts of things that no longer can be brought back in. Notably, it sold off, or rather the government sold off all the rolling stock, and nobody is actually going to rebuy that. And also you then have this complicated interrelationship, as you said, between the track and infrastructure and the operations. Blending that back in is the key to saving money, but that doesn't necessarily recreate the old British Rail. You'd have to do a lot more, some of which is probably impossible, but it would be a start. If you had it all under one organisation. Now, the problem is there are plans to create this Great British Railways, which this legislation is due to come in quite soon. They got yet another consultation about it, another review about it, which I just came out on June the 9th, and so on. But they are working towards Great British Railways. The trouble is there is still this obsession that you have to outsource the operations. And so we're going to end up with a kind of half-baked re-nationalisation that doesn't work. I mean, in my mind, I'm not a supporter of privatisation, but if you're going to privatise it, just privatise it. And if you're going to nationalise it properly. But having yet another half-baked solution, I think, will be expensive and ineffective.
It's easier to pass the blame, though, isn't it? For each side, if you do that, maybe that's part of it. But what about the issue that we face now, which is, we've got railway workers striking, saying they're not getting paid enough. So I looked at the average. You can look in different places to try and find out what the average railway worker is getting. But if you look at the site totaljobs.com, they say the average salary for railway workers is $45,000. Based on 414 jobs that are available right now. And I look at that.
No, that's not right. That's not right.
Isn't it?
Those are available jobs, and they tend to be at the managerial end. As I understand it, it's about 30 grand is the right. 31,000 is about the median level. Of course, there's some very highly paid people at the top there, but the average, staff worker on the platform or the gate line is likely to get around 30k.
But more for train drivers. So I think train drivers.
The train drivers get a lot more, yes. Yeah. But they're not on strike at the moment, and they're not surprisingly pretty satisfied with their lot.
Yeah, I should think so, because they're getting paid like a lot more than a HGV driver, for example. And I think there's probably a lot more a lot more skill and stress involved in trying to navigate the traffic than trying to make sure that you're keeping the train on the tracks.
No, there's a lot of skill required to drive a train. Remember, you're in charge of possibly 1,000 people, and it is a highly skilled job. But nevertheless, they are paid pretty well compared to those other jobs you mentioned.
And they're trying to create efficiencies like getting rid of less staff on the trains, for example. Is that a sensible move?
I think that's a big mistake. Yes, the government is portraying the industry as having 19th century practices. Actually, how's this for a statistic that is in my book? Under British Rail, in the 50 years, they went from 650,000 workers to 150,000 workers. In other words, they shed, in the 50 years of the BR existence, 10,000 jobs a year. And some of that has continued. Although under privatisation, the numbers have gone up because precisely a lot of people are marking each other's homework. And there's a whole host of people have been taken on, for example, to attribute delays. If you have a delay, whose fault is it? Is it the freight companies? Is it the train operators? Is it Network Rail? And we need to know that because they all have to pay compensation to one another. So the privatisation process actually made the railways.
Yeah, but Christian, forgive me for putting my neocon hat on at this point and saying the idea that a nationalised industry is more efficient than a privatised system, when the incentive, the profit incentive, if you like, is lacking. It's simply a system that works because people pay you to come to work, end of. It seems to go against all economic orthodoxy.
No, it doesn't. No. That's the idea, and the neocon idea, as you confess, that people only do...
That hat doesn't suit him, by the way.
No, it's not my norm. It doesn't fit me at all.
Right. And I think people only do things for money. They need financial incentives. This is the whole kind of indeed the neocon idea that the chief executive needs to be paid £1 million extra because he ties his own shoelaces, and I think that really goes against a lot of what you see very good public service. I went on the railways in Norway earlier this year, and it was amazing how that was just a quietly run, efficient public service. The guards were incredibly friendly. There was nice food on board. Everything was very relaxed about it, and it was public service at its best. And I don't think that you need. There's good private sector organisations and there's good public sector organisations, but research has shown that it's not the ownership structure that makes an organisation good. It's the managers and the ethos of the organisation. You can have good or bad in both sectors.
Well, you can use the neocon argument as well to actually justify why wages are going up so much, and that's because if there's only one rail company and you're a train driver, you work for that company. If you've got multiple rail companies, you choose which one you work for, and you sort of can pitch for higher wages. I don't know how much of that's going on.
No, that's going on enormously with the drivers. I mean, the other staff less so, but one of the reasons why drivers get 50, 60k a year is because they bid up the train operators against each other, which is quite an ironic thing, that the way that it was structured has meant that the drivers have as you say, a kind of advantage because they have a skill that is not easily replicatable. So their wages have been bid up enormously. That is one that ASLEF has laughed all the way to the bank in that.
So just quickly on the rail strike. So are you a supporter of it? Do you think they've got a case?
Well, I slightly sit on the fence of this because I do feel they have a case. I do feel that the government is really liking the idea of confrontation to take the mind of the people off all sorts of other issues. It's not kind of working towards a solution. I mean, Grant Shapps has refused to sit down with the unions, claim it's nothing to do with him, which is nonsense because, of course, it is all to do with him. But I do think that the railway workers are probably making a mistake in terms of the fact that I can't really see how they can win this. It's against an obdurate government intent on confrontation. They've got real problems, but they do have a case. They haven't had a wage rise for 2 or 3 years. I think it's unseemly for government ministers, as happened with Simon Clarke, the Treasury Minister yesterday, to go on the radio and say, well, sorry, chaps, you can't have an inflation rise, just an inflation, not inflation busting, but an inflation rise because that's inflationary, and therefore you have to take a hit to your living standards. Yeah,
but that applies to everybody, doesn't it?
More poorly,
but that is the big fear, isn't it? Because I mean, the Bank of England saying inflation could reach 11% this year, and that there is this big fear, and that's why they push up interest rates. They want people to actually lose jobs so that there's a push down on wages. Because otherwise, if everyone got an inflation wage of 11%, they're right, we would have a spiraling of inflation. So they're trying to keep it under control where they can.
I don't see the logic of that actually, because you have the inflation rise 1 year and then inflation goes down if it's due to these external circumstances, and the next year you have a lower pay rise.
Totally with you, but
I don't buy that.
Try telling the Bank of England
I'm going to steer Phil and you away from what's a more general economic argument at the moment. And actually what I want to do, Christian, is mention something which we haven't in any of this, which relates, I suppose, to the whole issue of mass investment. And let's say HS2, we haven't mentioned it, is, the costs are staggering. The incompetence so far, I have to say, and what we've seen of the way it's been handled has been pretty staggering too. And even if, again, looking at something different, but another government or local authority body pushing the Elizabeth line, of course, came in hugely late, hugely over budget, is actually there. I mean, again, wearing my neocon hat, the efficiency of government in doing big projects of this kind necessary for the rail infrastructure isn't very obvious, is it?
And what are we up to? About 98 billion is the sort of latest cost, I think, estimate, and that's without the leg to Leeds. It keeps going up.
Yes, I mean, there's various costs for it. They do try and chop bits off it, as they have done recently by chopping off a link a bit north of Manchester. But they are spending. I mean, it's remarkable, actually. Just to consider this for a moment, that we have a government that's intent on squeezing the rail unions that says, well, we're going to have to cut back on the timetable because the railway is costing so much. And yet they're spending 100 million a week, 100 million a week, that's 5 billion a year on HS2. And a railway, frankly, I've always argued is probably unnecessary and, the wrong way to go about kind of boosting capacity. And yet, they're stuck with that. And so there's a big contradiction there. But to pick up your point about the general large projects, yes, large projects have always tended to go over budget, and that's why they end up in government hands, because the private sector can't take the risk of them. But take the Elizabeth line. Okay, it's 25% over the original budget, which was a bit of a squeeze, and it's 3 years late. But go to talk to anyone who has been on the Elizabeth line, and they'll say, look, this is magnificent. We want more of this. And in a way, really, stuff like that is priceless.
Yeah.
What would London be without the London Underground, which, was built largely by the private sector, actually, but usually they kind of lost money or certainly struggled to break even. And yet have left an amazing legacy. And the Elizabeth line is an amazing legacy. Right. And we need, it's testimony to how efficient railways are, that you couldn't, deliver, thousands of people into Oxford Circus or Bond Street or whatever efficiently.
Haven't been on it yet, but yeah, I've heard
without it being on the railway.
Heard only good things about it. Look, I can give you an argument for HS2 maybe to wrap up, and you can disagree with me, which would be a bit bizarre because you're the one championing railways. But look, a couple of figures first of all before I talk about HS2. The number of rail journeys for the first 2 decades of this century has increased on average 3.5%. The amount of distance travelled on our roads by cars has grown by less than 1%. So when more of us are moving over to trains, but in 2019, the total kilometres driven by cars was 448 billion. By train, it was less than 67 billion. So we're travelling almost 7 times more by car. But as we said earlier, trains might actually be cheaper than cars. And if fuel goes up, then maybe there'll be more interest in train travel. But we have that big problem that do we have the capacity? And the answer is clearly no, which then becomes HS2. Do we build more railways so that we have more capacity? If you've got faster trains on a railway line where every train is fast without having to stop at stations, then obviously you can run them every 5 minutes if you want and they don't get held up. So, presumably you'd get much more capacity off the one line. And finally, just in my final case with HS2, my lord, is there's an economic argument called economic complexity, that large economies do very well when there's a mix of industries and greater connectivity within the country. So that would mean that you've got a business that's developing in Leeds that needs regular interaction with a company in the southeast of England. And those companies and those countries that develop that economic complexity tend to export more, they produce more sophisticated products, and because they're producing more sophisticated products, they are therefore more future-proof and more likely to innovate. So scientists have got a formula behind all of this economic complexity, and top of the pile, the countries that are doing really well on this are Japan, Switzerland, South Korea and Germany. We rank 13th, but you look at those top countries, interestingly, they've all got high-speed rail networks.
Yes, no, that's a convincing case, and I think you've argued it better than the HS2 press office do, frankly. I think that to counter that, I would say that if I was Transport Secretary and I had 100 billion to spend, I would invest it in urban infrastructure, particularly for cycling, for suburban railways, for underground railways, tramway systems, getting people off their cars in the urban context where most of that mileage that you mentioned takes place. And I'll spend some of it on improving the existing network, getting around kind of certain bottlenecks on the railway system and so on, and not all on one grand projet that will serve some people who happen to live near it or on it very well, but will also generate an awful lot of car journeys because there's very few stations and people will end up driving to the nearest station and so on. But I commend your very succinct and
we'll send. He moonlights for HS2. This is the awful dirty secret. Yes. But Christian, as we draw this discussion, fascinating discussion, to a close, let me inject one thing. I'd be interested to get your view on it briefly. The suggestion that perhaps actually we're not going to use trains or indeed any other form of transport as much as we used to. Signs that post-pandemic, we're not getting back into our cars or onto the trains as much as we did. More working from home, of course. That's a bit of a cliche, a general aversion perhaps to going places as well as a hangover from that. And if that's true, maybe all this is slightly academic. We're just not going to go anywhere very much anymore.
I don't buy that at all. Human beings always like travel. We like interaction. It's interesting that actually leisure travel is almost back up to the 100% pre-pandemic levels. Yes, there's going to be some people who are going to work from home more. I was in a pub on Monday up in town a couple of weeks ago, and there was absolutely virtually nobody in it at all. I think, working is going to become, working in the office is Tuesdays to Thursdays now, apparently. I think they call it twats. But I think some of that will be reined back. Some of the companies running offices will want to see more of their employees. Some of it will be replaced by, as I say, the leisure travel. And I think that overall, the impact will be a significant percentage, maybe 10 or 15% fewer kind of people going to the office on average, but we're still going to need the rail service to deliver the other people there. And I don't think this is an existential threat. I think it's just one that the railways will need to adapt to. And it might well be a good thing. I mean, actually, peak times are expensive for railways. They don't really like peak trains because they have to buy the peak times because they have to buy extra trains to operate. They only operate kind of twice in the day. Got to pay
more staff. So it's all that peak usage thing, isn't it? Look, I'm really glad we're not on the BBC because when you said twats, we would have had to have cut you off at that point. But it's been great to have you on, Christian. It's been a useful half hour. Thanks.
Yeah, indeed, a really fascinating look there at the railways and their future and what may it be. Well, we've talked about the destination, we've talked about how we get there, and I suppose the unanswered question, which none of us can answer, is whether we'll get there on time before the whole system grinds to a halt. But Christian, thank you so much, very much thanks to you for a fascinating chat about that key subject here on the Y-Curve.
And we should add that Christian has a new book out that he mentioned fleetingly, British Rail, A New History by Christian Wolmar, £20 on Amazon for the hardback edition. You can read it while you're waiting for the trains to start again, perhaps. Now, next week, as NATO meets in Madrid, what has Ukraine done to an organisation that seemed to be losing its way? Has Ukraine actually given NATO renewed purpose? We'll talk to the Telegraph's defence and security editor next week on the Y-Curve. See you then. Thanks for listening.
The Y-Curve.